They thought no one was watching, just a tired mom, a stroller, and a quiet park. But a few benches away sat the one man who doesn't need to stand to deliver justice, Chucknorris. What follows is a tale of intimidation transformed into humiliation, of arrogance crushed by quiet confidence. Five bikers will learn the hardest lesson of their lives when they mistake a mother's gentleness for weakness, never suspecting that the unassuming man in the cowboy hat observing them is a legend whose roundhouse kick once created the Grand Canyon. A peaceful afternoon in Maple Ridge Park is about to become the stage for an unforgettable demonstration of what happens when bullies meet their match. And that match happens to be Chuck Norris. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Ridge Park, its golden rays filtering through the autumn leaves. Sarah Matthews pushed her daughter's stroller along the winding path, the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath the wheels almost meditative. Her shoulders slumped slightly, carrying the invisible weight that only single parents understand. "Almost there, Emma," she whispered to her sleeping 3-year-old. "Mommy just needs a moment." Sarah had been on her feet since 5 a.m. The early shift at the diner, followed by a doctor's appointment for Emma's recurring ear infections, had left her drained. This peaceful hour at the park was her sanctuary, the only time she had to herself before heading home to prepare dinner and tackle a mountain of laundry. Finding an empty bench near the duck pond, Sarah eased the stroller to a stop and sat down, allowing herself a deep breath. She reached into her bag for the worn paperback she'd been trying to finish for weeks. Just 20 pages today, she promised herself. 20 pages of escape. 3 benches away, partially obscured by a towering oak tree, sat a solitary figure. His weathered cowboy hat cast a shadow over eyes that had seen more battles than most men could imagine. His posture was relaxed but alert, a stillness that spoke of disciplined patience. Chuck Norris wasn't there for any particular reason. Sometimes a man just needs to sit in a park, observe nature, and reflect on life. He noticed the young mother immediately. The careful way she positioned the stroller to block the autumn breeze from her child, the slight wince when she finally allowed herself to sit, the momentary escape in her eyes when she opened her book. Chuck recognized it all too well, the quiet struggle of someone carrying more than they should have to alone. He returned to his own thoughts, occasionally glancing around the park, with the habitual awareness of someone who has spent a lifetime assessing his surroundings. The elderly couple feeding ducks, the college students throwing a frisbee, the joggers circling the perimeter. All was peaceful, until it wasn't. The distant rumble came first, a mechanical growl that seemed to cut through the tranquility of the afternoon. Chuck's eyes narrowed slightly, his senses shifting to a higher state of alertness without any outward change in his demeanor. 5 motorcycles rolled into the park's west entrance, their engines deliberately loud, disrupting the calm. They weren't just any bikers. Their leather cuts displayed the emblem of the Steel Demons, a group known more for intimidation than organized crime, but trouble nonetheless. Sarah glanced up from her book, instinctively reaching for the stroller and pulling it closer. Chuck observed the subtle motion, the protective instinct of a mother sensing potential danger. His eyes tracked the bikers as they dismounted near the playground, their laughter too loud, their presence too imposing. For a while, they seemed content to just occupy space, passing bottles and paper bags between them and making crude jokes. Parkgoers began to give them a wide berth. The elderly couple abandoned their duck feeding. Parents quietly collected their children from the playground equipment. Chuck remained still, observing. There was no crime in being loud or unpleasant. Not yet. The bikers noticed the emptying playground and the averted gazes. Power shifts were something they understood well, and they clearly enjoyed being the cause of discomfort. Their leader, a hulking man with a shaved head and a beard streaked with gray, scanned the remaining park visitors like a predator, assessing which prey might provide the most entertainment. His gaze landed on Sarah. "Well, well, boys," he announced, his voice carrying across the now quieter park. "Looks like we found ourselves the perfect spot for a little afternoon relaxation." The group moved toward the duck pond, deliberately taking the path that would lead them past Sarah's bench. Chuck observed her body language, the stiffening of her shoulders, the way her knuckles whitened around her book, the protective hand that moved to the stroller cover. But she kept her eyes down, hoping invisibility might be her shield. It rarely is. "Afternoon, sweetheart," the leader said, stopping directly in front of her bench. "Park's getting pretty empty. Not very sociable of everyone, is it?" Sarah nodded politely without making eye contact. "Excuse me, I need to get going," she said quietly, closing her book and reaching for the stroller. One of the bikers, a lanky man with tattoos crawling up his neck, stepped forward to block her path. "What's the rush?" "We're just being friendly." "Right, Blade?" he called to their leader. "Absolutely," Blade replied, taking a seat at the far end of Sarah's bench. "Just some community engagement. This is a public park after all." The remaining bikers formed a loose semicircle around the bench. Not quite threatening, but definitely intimidating. Deliberate. Calculated. "Cute kid," said a biker with a patchy goatee, leaning over the stroller. "Boy or girl?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "Girl, please. She's sleeping." "Got a name?" Blade asked, scooting closer on the bench. "Emma," Sarah replied, her eyes darting around the park, searching for help. A few onlookers quickly averted their gaze, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Chucknorris observed the situation unfolding with increasing attention. His relaxed posture hadn't changed, but anyone who knew him would recognize the slight narrowing of his eyes, the calm before a very specific kind of storm. "Emma, pretty name," Blade said, reaching into his jacket. "I bet Emma would like to see what Uncle Blade has in his pocket." He pulled out a switchblade, flicking it open casually. "Just a little something I carry for protection. Dangerous world out there." Sarah's breath caught. "Please, we don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Blade feigned offense. "We're just having a friendly conversation. Right, boys?" The other bikers laughed, closing their circle tighter. "Maybe you could make a small donation to our club," the tattooed biker suggested. "Community support and all that. Whatever's in your wallet should cover it." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she fumbled for her purse. "I don't have much." "I'm sure it'll be enough," Blade said. "And then maybe you can join us for a little ride. Someone can watch your kid. Tattoo here loves babies, don't you, Tattoo?" The lanky biker grinned, revealing a row of yellow teeth. "Love 'em." A small whimper escaped Sarah's lips as she clutched her purse with trembling hands. Emma stirred in the stroller, sensing her mother's distress. "Excuse me, gentlemen," came a calm, measured voice from behind them. "The lady and her daughter are trying to enjoy the park." The bikers turned to find Chucknorris standing a few feet away. Nothing about his stance was threatening. His hands weren't even out of his pockets. Just a man in a cowboy hat, jeans, and a simple button-down shirt. Blade snorted. "Well, if it isn't the local sheriff, this is a private conversation, old man. Keep walking." Chuck's expression remained neutral. "I believe the lady was just leaving." His eyes met Sarah's, conveying a silent message. "Get ready to move." "And I said she stays," Blade countered, standing to his full height, towering over Chuck by several inches. "Unless you want to make something of it, cowboy." The other bikers spread out, forming a loose circle around Chuck. 5 against 1. A man in his 80s against young, muscled troublemakers. The odds seemed clear. "Last chance," Chuck said quietly. "Walk away now and we forget this happened." Blade laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "You hear that, boys? Grandpa's giving us a chance to walk away." He flicked his switchblade again, the metal catching the afternoon sunlight. "I don't think you understand the situation, old-timer." Chuck sighed. It was almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of a man who had seen this scenario play out 1,000 times before. "I understand perfectly. You're about to make a series of very poor decisions." "Get him, Tattoo," Blade ordered. The lanky biker lunged forward, swinging a wild haymaker aimed at Chuck's head. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, when witnesses tried to describe it, they couldn't agree on the sequence of events. Chuck's hand emerged from his pocket in a blur, catching Tattoo's wrist mid-swing. A subtle twist, the sound of bones grinding together, and suddenly Tattoo was on his knees, his face contorted in silent agony as Chuck applied precise pressure to nerves that most medical textbooks barely documented. "The human wrist contains 8 carpal bones," Chuck stated calmly, as if delivering a casual anatomy lesson. "I'm currently compressing just one. Would you like to experience what happens when I move to the second?" Tattoo shook his head frantically, his face pale. "Smart choice," Chuck said, releasing him. Tattoo collapsed to the ground, cradling his wrist. The other bikers stood frozen, the sudden shift in power dynamics impossible to process. "Who the hell are you, man?" one of them finally asked. Chuck turned his gaze toward them, his expression unchanged. Just a concerned citizen. Recognition dawned slowly on Blade's face. "Wait a minute. You can't be." "The lady and her daughter were leaving," Chuck repeated. "I suggest you let them pass." Blade's recognition turned to rage. His ego couldn't accept the humiliation. "Take him!" he shouted to his remaining crew. "There's 4 of us left." "Technically," Chuck commented, "there are 4 of you total." The bikers charged simultaneously, a tactical error born of desperation. Chuck moved with the fluid precision of a man who had mastered his body's capabilities decades ago and never stopped honing them. A roundhouse kick sent the first biker spinning into the duck pond with a spectacular splash. The second received an open palm strike to the solar plexus that left him gasping on the ground, unable to draw breath, yet uninjured beyond his pride. The third biker, slightly smarter than his companions, attempted to circle behind Chuck. Without even looking, Chuck sidestepped at precisely the right moment, extending his foot just enough for the biker to trip over it and crash headfirst into a trash can. Throughout it all, Chuck's expression never changed. There was no anger, no exertion, not even satisfaction, just the serene focus of someone performing a necessary task. Blade, suddenly alone, backed away, his switchblade held out in front of him like a talisman. "Stay back. I'll cut you, old man." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "The average human hand contains 27 bones. The average switchblade contains 1. Care to test which is more durable?" "You don't scare me," Blade shouted, his voice betraying his lie. Chuck nodded toward the stroller. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm giving you a chance to walk away before you do something that crosses a line you can't uncross." For a moment it seemed Blade might actually take the wise path. Then with a roar of wounded pride, he lunged forward, blade extended. Chuck didn't even move his feet. His upper body swayed just enough for the blade to pass harmlessly by. His right hand shot out, gripping Blade's wrist with precise pressure. His left hand delivered a strike to Blade's elbow. Not hard enough to break, but enough to send a shock of pain up the arm. The knife clattered to the ground. "When I was a young man," Chuck said conversationally as he maintained his grip on Blade's wrist, "my instructor told me something I never forgot. He said, 'True power isn't found in dominating others, but in having the restraint not to, even when you could.'" With seemingly no effort, Chuck twisted Blade's arm behind his back, forcing the larger man to his knees. "I'm demonstrating that restraint right now," Chuck continued. "I could easily dislocate your shoulder, break your arm in 7 different places, or render you unconscious in 3 seconds. Instead, I'm going to let you go with a lesson." He leaned closer to Blade's ear. "Harassing women and children doesn't make you strong. It makes you a target. My target." Chuck released him with a gentle push forward. Blade stumbled, then scrambled to his feet, backing away. Who are you?" he gasped. Chuck adjusted his cowboy hat slightly. "Just someone who believes that bullies eventually meet their match." By now a small crowd had gathered at a safe distance. Someone had called the police, and sirens could be heard approaching. "I suggest you and your friends leave before those sirens get any closer," Chuck advised. "Unless you'd like to explain to the officers why you were threatening a mother and child with a knife." Blade looked at his scattered crew, one soaking wet from the pond, one still gasping for breath, one extracting himself from a trash can, and one nursing a wrist that might never be the same. His decision was swift. "Let's go," he barked, helping Tattoo to his feet. The bikers collected themselves in their wounded pride, retreating to their motorcycles with backward glances of disbelief and newfound respect. As the motorcycles roared to life and quickly disappeared from the park, the gathered onlookers burst into spontaneous applause. Chuck turned away from the attention, walking instead towards Sarah, who stood trembling beside her stroller, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Are you and your daughter all right, ma'am?" Chuck asked gently. Sarah nodded, wiping at her tears. "Yes, thanks to you. I don't know what would have happened if—" Chuck raised a hand to stop her. "No need to think about that now. They're gone. Emma had awakened during the commotion and was looking up at Chuck with wide, curious eyes. He smiled down at her, his weathered face softening. "That's a beautiful little girl you have," he said. "Thank you," Sarah replied, "for everything. You were amazing. I've never seen anything like that." Chuck shrugged modestly. "Just basic self-defense. Nothing special." A park goer approached tentatively. "Excuse me, but are you Chuck Norris?" Before he could answer, others joined in. "It is him! Chuck Norris! Can I get a picture?" Sarah's eyes widened with recognition. "Oh my God, you're that Chuck Norris!" Chuck smiled apologetically as the crowd began to gather. "I'm afraid I am." "Why did you help us?" Sarah asked, genuinely puzzled. "You could have been hurt." Chuck looked at her with gentle amusement. "Ma'am, the only danger in that situation was how much restraint I'd need to use." His expression grew more serious. "And as for why, because someone should. That's all the reason anyone ever needs." The police arrived, and after taking statements and ensuring everyone was safe, they offered to escort Sarah and Emma home. As she prepared to leave, Sarah approached Chuck one more time. "Mr. Norris, I don't know how to thank you." Chuck knelt down to Emma's level in the stroller. "You know what would be nice? If next time you're in this park, it's a happier visit. Maybe feed those ducks over there." He pointed to the pond where one very confused duck was still watching the biker who had taken an unexpected swim. Sarah smiled through her tears. "We will." "And remember," Chuck added, standing back up, "strength isn't about intimidating others. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're afraid. Especially when you're afraid." As Sarah and Emma departed with the police escort, the crowd around Chuck continued to grow. People with phones out, questions flying, admiration evident in their eyes. "Mr. Norris, how did you take down 5 men without breaking a sweat?" Chuck adjusted his hat. "I did break a sweat. It's just that my sweat is so intimidating, it immediately evaporated out of respect." The crowd laughed. "Seriously, though," Chuck continued, "in my experience, those who prey on the vulnerable usually don't know how to face someone who stands their ground." "But why risk yourself for strangers?" someone else asked. Chuck looked across the park, now peaceful again as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. "Because we're not really strangers. We're all sharing this space, this moment, this life. And if we don't look out for each other, especially those who need protection, then what are we doing here?" He declined further questions and photographs, politely excusing himself. As he walked away through the lengthening shadows of the park, people watched with a newfound appreciation, not just for the legend they had witnessed in action, but for the simple truth he embodied. The story of what happened in Maple Ridge Park that day spread quickly. For Sarah and Emma, it became a turning point, a reminder that even in their darkest moments, they were not truly alone. Sarah eventually went back to school, became a social worker, and years later established a self-defense program for single parents. As for the bikers, local legend says they reformed their club, focusing on community service and protection rather than intimidation. Though this might be embellishment, Blade was reportedly seen a year later volunteering at a women's shelter. And Chuck Norris, he continued being Chuck Norris, sitting in parks, observing nature, reflecting on life, and occasionally, very occasionally, reminding the world that true heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear cowboy hats. The measure of a society isn't found in how it treats its strongest members, but in how it protects its most vulnerable. And sometimes that protection comes from the most unexpected sources, a reminder that we all have the capacity to stand up, to step in, to make a difference. Even when we think no one is watching, someone might be. Someone like Chuck Norris.